So, how do we find the larger stories of our lives? As human beings, we have this inbuilt, unquenchable desire to make sense of things through science, through philosophy, through therapy, through religion. And stories are the byproduct of that desire. They are the connections we make out of all of the information that we are bombarded with. They are the markers and clues from which we can frame a larger narrative of life. And as any writer will tell you, it's hard to do that when you don't know what your ending's going to be. But we all do it. We are all storytellers. What I've learned as an author and illustrator is that when we create stories, making sense is not just a challenge, but a great moral responsibility. Take this guy, for example. It's pretty easy to recognize, yes. Humpty Dumpty, folklore's ultimate fall guy. A year ago, I was approached with the opportunity to create my own versions of Mother Goose rhymes and books. And it was a simple task. I just had to transcribe the original rhymes and add my own distinctive artwork to the proceedings. It's been done thousands of times by this point. And I'm showing you Humpty Dumpty because this spheroid schlemiel just so happens to be the poster boy for what most Mother Goose rhymes are actually about. Has anyone ever wondered what the central idea worth spreading in nursery rhymes is? It's this. That's right. Bad things happen. Humpty breaks, Jack and Jill fall down the hill, the three blind mice lose their tails, little Miss Muffet gets traumatized by the spider and goes into therapy for the rest of her life. There's violence and cruelty and accidents and death. It's like Game of Thrones or something. In fact, in 1941, there was even such thing as the British Society for Nursery Rhyme Reform, which condemned over 100 Mother Goose rhymes for their references to poverty, choking, hangings, decapitation, child abuse, body snatching, and even the devouring of human flesh. It was bleak. Now, to cap it all off, Mother Goose rhymes are all wantonly random. And I'm a real beginning, middle, and end kind of a storyteller. I prefer for my tales to be more than just a string of arbitrary events and characters. So the prospect of simply recycling these literary downers held very little interest for me. Invariably, as a storyteller, I find that the challenge I'm presented with is rarely the challenge that I choose to solve. For me, it wasn't, how do I tell these stories? It was, what story would I rather be telling? So I went away and came up with the idea for this book series instead, Mother Goose Retold. The premise is that the rhymes begin the way they always do, but once the rhymes end, the story continues in the form of new verses, taking the characters into unexpected places and revealing greater layers of meaning. It was my attempt to find the larger stories within the smaller ones, to make sense out of nonsense. So I chose to approach each rhyme as though the clues to the larger narrative were already somewhere hidden within the code of the original. I just had to find that code, I had to find the clues, and I had to follow them to their logical conclusion. Let's go back to Humpty Dumpty. I started off by asking myself two questions. What makes me curious, and what just plain bothers me? And when you want to make sense, Humpty Dumpty really bothers me. Let's just start off by accepting the fact that Humpty is an anthropomorphized egg. Okay, I'll buy that. But even in a world where that makes sense, what makes fixing an egg a palace priority? I mean, why does the king send his entire workforce? I know that's a rather bizarre hill to die on, but it's always confused me. And the only way that I could think to explain it was to go into the illustrations and suggest that this was a kingdom that for one reason or another deified eggs. So I put eggs into the architecture, I made the palace dome an egg, and I made the hot air balloons eggs, and I put eggs on the insignias and the uniforms and the cutlery. I put eggs on everything. It just made more sense to me, like perhaps this was a culture whose ideology was that the egg did come before the chicken, or perhaps they were symbols and remnants left behind by some egg-obsessed secret society denoting the cycle of life and birth and death and metamorphosis. I don't know. I got really Dan Brown about it. By the way, bear with me. This is the level of logic we will be working with here. But tangents aside, the thing that really bothers me about Humpty Dumpty is, why would a fragile thing with an awkward center of gravity, prone to wobbling, choose to sit on a wall in the first place? I mean, why would a vulnerable thing needlessly endanger itself? So I went back into the story and I followed it into the new pages. And how do you continue the story of the world's ultimate loser? Well, it's easy. You just make his situation even worse. So Humpty wakes up and he's in an egg cup surrounded by kitchen utensils. And the king's chefs are trying to figure out the best way to salvage him. So they're arguing over different recipes. Do they boil him? Do they poach him? Do they pickle him? Do they scramble him? And Humpty's telling them to leave him alone. But they're ignoring him because now that he is broken, Humpty has become invisible. And he gets so angry and upset at being so helpless that he rocks about in his cup and he yells at the top of his lungs and he stands up for himself and the pieces of his shell fall away and he hatches into a chick. Now, that ending kind of blew my mind when it first came to me because it manages to answer in one fell swoop why Humpty's an egg and why he sat on the wall in the first place. It was because deep down he knew that he belonged up in the sky. He was just too timid to come out of his shell. See what I did there? And this reveals the larger story of Humpty Dumpty, which is that we only truly discover who we really are in the face of tragedy and adversity, that being broken does not simply change us, it also reveals us. So I went and applied this method to a few of the other rhymes. With Little Miss Muffet here, I wanted to see what was going on from the spider's point of view. I also wanted to understand why the spider would choose to sit down beside her, which doesn't sound very craven, it sounds friendly, if anything. So I flipped the perspective for the reader to reveal that the spider is in fact also a little girl who's just as frightened of Miss Muffet but was going out on a limb. Therefore, the larger story of Little Miss Muffet is that as much as fear can be informed by danger, it can also be informed by ignorance, that we fear what we don't yet understand. Twinkle Twinkle is a far cheerier rhyme, but even that left me clues of where I can take the story. In the latter, less well-known verses, the narrator makes reference to a traveler in the dark. He's mentioned twice, and I couldn't help feeling like he was somehow important. So in my version, I made the narrator a little girl, and I made the traveler her father, who she misses. And in the final verses, the narration shifts to the star's perspective, describing how it is guiding a father back home to his family. See, the real fun of extending these stories is discovering the value of what's already there. If you add enough perspective, a larger story will always present itself. And it changes the moral from bad things happen to bad things happen, but here's what you can learn from it. So, I was surprised after having immersed myself in all this folklore for a year to discover just how much the medium has changed, especially in the last century. Storytelling today has evolved into a global multimedia industry. We're talking books, animated films, games, DVDs, and every conceivable spin-off product you can imagine. And this is great news for storytellers, but it can come at a cost for the intended audience because as much as we serve the story, we now also serve the bottom line. And with this shift, this need for profit, folklore today, instead of preparing children for the idea that life is inherently flawed, it instead tries to sell us a vision of the world that preaches that life can be perfect. And with this opposite way of thinking, we run the risk of making smaller stories rather than the larger ones, because we've shifted our values from the intrinsic to the extrinsic in the sake of a profitable illusion. So, a good example of this is the Merida controversy. The movie Brave introduced the character of Merida to mainstream audiences. She was an animated princess who defied the expectations of the archetype. She wasn't reliant upon a male lead for a romantic interest. She was battle-hardened and independent, and she fought for her right to not be reduced to a societal mold. And as you can imagine in all modern folklore, she wins in the end. So you can imagine how upset mothers and daughters alike were when, after the release of the movie, a marketing team created this version of that same character, squeezing her back into the cookie-cutter template of all the princesses that had come before her. She was a sparkly, nipped, tucked doppelganger that the actual Merida would probably have cringed at. By adding conformism to a character who symbolized conformity, this marketing team reduced that character's life to its smallest representation and narrowed the world of her audience in the process. Now, don't get me wrong. Making a more perfect Merida as a product makes perfect financial sense. It does. But making perfect sense in the wrong direction can have unforeseen consequences. The problem I have is not with princesses in general, but the kind of princesses that we're now being given. Because there's something about the inflexibility of the princess mold, that the brand, that just makes me curious. Like, for example, have you ever noticed that if you were to take the average princess doll and, say, paint them blue and pin tails on them, their physical proportions are exactly the same as those weird cat aliens from Avatar? Worse, actually, they look like the cat people from Avatar after they've been on a hunger strike. Just large eyes and long necks and spindly legs and emaciated skeletons. It's all perfectly natural, provided you're not human. It's easy to forget that the first Disney princesses were designed in an era when girls were still strapping themselves into corsets. But rather than update this antiquated body type, today's girls are encouraged to simply exchange their corsets for something more practical, like, say, an eating disorder. While this is true that boys can also suffer from this affliction, at least we had characters like Homer Simpson and Fred Flintstone that taught us that it was okay to have broader waistlines, that we could be imperfect and still be masculine. However, if you were to look at Fred and Homer's skinnier, more attractive wives, the story is not the same for girls. And this is not just a disservice to women, mind. This is a greater disservice to all of us. Because when we impose a strict standard of beauty upon the entire world, then we're the ones who miss out on best friends, collaborators, peers, and great loves who defy that standard. We exclude ourselves from the broadest spectrum of our possibilities, and that really bothers me. So that's why I created this satirical cartoon and published it on Huffington Post, just after the Merida controversy surfaced, in which I took 10 real-life female role models and then put them through a sparkly princess makeover. It was my attempt to show just how ridiculous the archetype is, how limiting it is, and how much nonsense there is in it. Now, people's responses to this blog taught me a few things. For one thing, I learned that sparkles are not a great look on a woman who's famous for dying of radiation poisoning. Yeah. But more importantly, I learned that people want the larger story. The blog exploded online. It attracted millions of views, and it was published and printed and reposted and shared, and people dissected and debated it, and it struck a chord on both sides of the argument because people wanted to ask big questions like, is this the only template that role models can be accepted in? If our real-life heroes don't conform to any mold, then why do we insist that our fictitious ones do? And what is the larger story for men and women? It was a perfect storm, all from this one image. And you can imagine my delight when Merida's creator, Brenda Chapman, joined the discussion to show her support, taking my story full circle. So, all of this has given me a newfound appreciation for these grim, violent nursery rhymes of old. For all their death and decapitation, all their fallibilities and frailties, it is the characters of Mother Goose who actually get it right. In fact, if you were to go back to our revisionist friends at the British Society for Nursery Rhyme Reform, there's a reason why a lot of their proposed censorship fell mostly on deaf ears. It was because people understood that these symbolic instances of misfortune were cathartic for children and gave them the tools they needed to be able to resolve real issues in their real lives. As Bernice Cullinan, Professor Emeritus of Reading and Children's Literature in New York University, remarked, "Small children live in a world of giants. They have fears, and these tales give them the courage to grow up." It's tales like this that encourage us to get up after we fall down, to heal our wounds and to confront our fears and to try to come to terms with the unimaginable. As bleak and random as it may appear, one certainly learns to appreciate this message when the alternative is a far more insidious one. This makes it all the more important for us to fight for the intrinsic values in our lives, to become the champions of our imperfect existences, rather than becoming the failures in the face of an unattainable one. And this is something I know from my own personal experience, because ever since I was young, I've dreamed of being an author and illustrator. But for a long time, I struggled with the idea that I was unworthy of it, because the profession, even the title of author itself, awed me too much. I got lost in a neurotic maze of my own making. I thought that writing was something that required some innate, external grand eminence that I was lacking. But stories, it turns out, aren't found in the perfectly polished finish. They're found within the cracks, that it's through our unique flaws that our individuality can be revealed. And this is true of all of us, regardless of what we choose to be or do. The way that we tell fictitious stories is no different than the way that we cognitively reframe our real lives. Both are simply our attempt at making sense of realizing something more complex. Because for all their lunacy of nursery rhymes, our real lives are no less ridiculous. We still fall off walls, and we make mistakes, and we stumble and fall. We break and frighten easily. We gawk at things we can't comprehend, and we feel inadequate and unworthy. And throughout our confusion, we're constantly colliding with a circus of equally bizarre players who are just as lost and just as vibrant as we are, all in search of a less imperfect life. And as is true in reality and fiction, one day, the book closes. We're all living in a world of giants, searching for the courage to grow up. As storytellers, each and every one of us, it is our job not to make perfect sense of it all, but rather to make the best possible sense that we can. Thank you.